I've been doing some cleaning lately, and some of the old stuff I went through were some of my old video games. I picked up my copy of The Last of Us and I thought, man, I remember when that game came out. Good times. Wait a sec, am I feeling nostalgia for The Last of Us? When I think of a retro game, I don't think of The Last of Us. It's all HD and cinematic. But to be fair, it is 10 years old at this point. It came out in mid-2013. Is 10 years enough time for a game to be considered retro? I mean, when the Wii came out, it had the Virtual Console, which was a service on the Wii's online shop where you could download retro games like stuff for the NES, SNES, and Sega Genesis. But the Wii also had Nintendo 64 games, and the N64 was only 10 years old when the Wii came out. Super Mario 64 was technically a launch game for both the Nintendo 64 and the Nintendo Wii. I'm pretty sure most people back in 2006 considered Mario 64 to be retro at the time, and Mario 64 was 10 years old at the time. So isn't it only right that we treat The Last of Us the same way now? If we go by the 10-year rule, some other games that would be considered retro now are Minecraft, Dota 2, Candy Crush, League of Legends, and Final Fantasy XIV. Most people probably wouldn't consider these games to be retro though, probably because these games have continued to be updated over the years, and in fact, every single one of them has had an update within the past 3 months as of the time I'm writing this. But they were all originally released 10 or more years ago, so you could call all of these games retro. All of this got me wondering, when is a game considered retro? Is 9 years enough to be considered retro? That's how long it took for The Last of Us to get a remake. Is 8 years enough to be considered retro? The Game Boy Generation 1 Pokemon games got remakes only 8 years later in Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green on the Game Boy Advance. Is 6 years enough? The PS1 classics Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil both got remakes on the GameCube only 6 years after their original releases. The Game Boy Advance game Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories got a remake on the PlayStation 2 less than 2.5 years after its initial release. Okay, so maybe a game getting remade isn't a great barometer for deciding if a game is retro or not. Remasters and re-releases also muddy the water. That's probably why it's hard for me to think of Skyrim as being retro. It was getting re-released on a new system every few years. Updates, remasters, and re-releases constantly keep these games in our minds, and in a way sort of mentally prevent them from being considered retro. But to be perfectly honest, I don't even think this is necessarily a good reason to keep a game from being considered retro. Look at Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis in 1991. This game was re-released or remade at least 5 times before the game was even 10 years old, and some of the re-releases were on the original console it first came out on. But even with all of its releases, back in 2002, the game was considered to be a retro classic game, and it was included on the Sonic Mega Collection. So why did games that were around 10 years old feel retro back then, but games that are around 10 years old now don't feel like they're retro at all? So I decided to ask my audience. I did a poll asking people when they considered a game to be retro. Like I expected, basically no one voted for 1 to 4 years old. I mean, maybe if you're a kid, a game that came out 4 years ago might be retro for you, but besides that, yeah, I wasn't too surprised no one voted for this. There were a very small number of people that said games that were 5 to 9 years old were retro, and yeah, that one I can't agree with. There's no way I'm calling Dragon Ball FighterZ, Red Dead 2, Detroit Become Human, Monster Hunter World, and Among Us retro games, at least not for another several years. A somewhat sizable portion of people considered games that were 10 to 14 years old to be retro. I was actually a bit surprised more people didn't pick this one. 10 years is a nice round number that feels like a long time. 10 years is a decade ago. But hey, the results are the results. The next biggest slice of the vote went to games that are 20 plus years old. Going by that number, some games that would be considered retro today are Fire Emblem The Blazing Blade, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, The Simpsons Hit and Run, and Jak 2. Yeah, I'd say 20-year-old games are easily old enough to be considered retro. All of these games feel pretty old. The majority of people who voted said that a game is considered retro when it's at least 15 to 19 years old. And yeah, I would probably vote for this option too. So if we use that metric, some games that would be considered retro now are Call of Duty World at War, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, Left 4 Dead, Batman Arkham Asylum, and Bayonetta. These games all feel just old enough to have that retro label. I'd be okay with saying 15-year-old games are retro. Now, let's look at the comments and see how people felt about the topic. This one person says, I think the 3D days may have obstructed affected how we think of retro. I remember even during the early 2000s, the NES and SNES days was pretty retro already. This is a good point. One of the things that may influence how we feel about a game being retro or not is how the game looks. The more modern a game looks, the more difficult it is to see the game as being retro. For example, it's hard for me to think of a game like Resident Evil 5 as being retro, but I do think of Scribblenauts as a retro game, even though Resident Evil 5 came out the same year as Scribblenauts. Resident Evil 5, while outdated by today's standards, is still 3D and has some element of realism in its graphics, while Scribblenauts uses 2D sprites. 2D games, especially 2D games with pixel art, just feel older than 3D ones. Like, for example, did you know that Dead Rising and Mother 3 came out in the same year? Mother 3 feels like a dinosaur to me, but Dead Rising seems old but not ancient. I guess this point is pretty obvious. Games that look more retro feel more retro. And the feeling you get from playing the game is a large part of what determines what is retro or not. This comment here kind of sums up this point. I think it's less about how much time has passed and more about how much gaming has evolved since, because there isn't really a quantifiable amount of time that you can pinpoint for when a game becomes retro. This perspective makes a lot of sense. Being retro is less of a time thing and more about how the gaming landscape has changed since the game's released. Look at Kirby's Adventure, which was released in 1993 on the NES. The NES was originally released in 1983 as the Famicom in Japan, meaning Kirby's Adventure was released when the console was basically 10 years old. But Kirby's Adventure, while impressive for the console it was released on, still feels like an NES game. It feels the exact same to me as Excitebike and Punch-Out! Another comment had a similar sentiment. I don't really think I could call anything on GameCube or PS2 retro. What you got then is really what you get today in most respects. I do doubt that generation will ever be looked at like we look at the NES, unless in 20 years we can be absorbed into the code itself or something. I personally don't agree that GameCube and PS2 games aren't retro, but I do understand the idea behind the perspective. The 6th generation of consoles really solidified 3D games. In-game cameras improved, voice acting improved, budgets got bigger, development teams got bigger, online play even started to become more common in this era. As a whole, many of the staples of video games nowadays started in that era. Probably the reason why I personally see games from this era as being retro is because I grew up with this era. Like I mentioned before, a game being retro is a lot about feeling, and since I played games of this era in my youth, that nostalgia that I get when I play these games makes them seem more retro to me. To someone who didn't grow up with these games, it may not be that way. Someone else had a completely different perspective. I see retro as more of an era rather than something that expands over time. Everything on consoles released before 2000 is retro to me. This is an interesting take. A game being retro isn't about how old it is or how it makes you feel, it's a clear-cut time period. The same way we have eras in history like the Middle Ages in Europe and the Wild West in America and the Meiji period in Japan. Maybe for gaming, there's a retro era, a retro age. The more I think about it, the more I'm starting to like this idea. But hey, maybe you think it's stupid. So I guess let me know in the comments when you think a game is considered to be retro. Is it when a certain amount of time has passed? Is it when you get a feeling of nostalgia? Or is it when the game was released after a certain date? Or maybe it's none of those things. But anyway, that's all I've got to say. I'm gonna get out of here. So, thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day.